Pinning down when Fazbear Entertainment actually began in the world of Five Nights at Freddy's is one of those questions where the series deliberately leaves just enough ambiguity to keep theorists busy. There is no single explicit date given in the games, which means most of the discussion relies on piecing together environmental details, phone calls, minigames, and later lore reveals. The general consensus places the company's origins somewhere between the early 1970s and the early 1980s, but the reasoning behind each possible window varies depending on how you interpret the timeline. One of the strongest anchors for this discussion is Fazbear's Family Diner, which is widely understood to be the earliest known establishment tied to what would become Fazbear Entertainment. This small diner, associated with the partnership between William Afton and Henry Emily, predates the larger Freddy Fazbear's pizza chain. The existence of Springlock suits, particularly Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, suggests a transitional phase in animatronic technology, something more experimental and less standardized than what is seen later. Because the technology appears somewhat primitive and risky, many theorists argue that this points to a starting point closer to the early or mid-1970s, when such animatronic entertainment concepts were still relatively novel and unrefined. Another argument for a 70s origin comes from the aesthetic and cultural parallels. Real-world animatronic restaurant entertainment, like family pizza chains with robotic performers, began gaining traction in the 70s. The atmosphere implied in the minigames, simple stage setups, smaller venues, and a more local business feel, aligns more with that era than with the polished corporate branding seen later. If Fazbear Entertainment evolved out of Fredbear's Family Diner, then it's plausible that the company itself either formed in the late 70s or existed informally before becoming a structured business entity. On the other hand, there is a compelling case for an early 1980s founding, especially if one distinguishes between the diner and the official company. Some interpretations suggest that Fazbear Entertainment as a corporate brand did not exist during the diner phase at all. Instead, it may have been established only after the initial success of Fredbear's Family Diner, when the owners decided to expand into a larger franchise model. This would place the formal launch of Fazbear Entertainment closer to the early 80s, possibly around 1982 or 1983, which aligns with references to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza opening and becoming a recognizable chain. The year 1983 is particularly significant in the lore, often tied to key events like the Bite of '83 and the presence of multiple locations already in operation. If Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was already running by that time, then the company behind it must have been established slightly earlier. This leads some theorists to argue for a narrow window in the very early 80s, late 1981 through 1983, where Fazbear Entertainment transitions from a small partnership into a full-fledged company with branding, mascots, and multiple sites. Looking at the timeline specifically before Secret of the Mimic complicates things in an interesting way, because that part of the lore leans much more heavily on the earliest phase of animatronic development and the people behind it rather than the later corporate identity of Fazbear Entertainment. If you isolate the period before those events, you're essentially dealing with a proto-era where the technology, the characters, and even the business structure are still forming. One of the key implications often drawn from the Mimic storyline is that advanced endoskeleton and behavioral technology existed earlier than many originally assumed. The Mimic itself represents a level of adaptability and learning that feels ahead of the relatively stiff, performance-focused animatronics seen in Fredbear's Family Diner. Because of that, some theorists argue that the technological groundwork for Fazbear Entertainment must have begun well before the early 1980s, potentially pushing the origin back into the mid- or even early 1970s. In this view, what we see at the diner is not the beginning of innovation, but a more public-facing simplification of earlier, more experimental work. This leads to a reinterpretation of Fazbear Entertainment's launch. Instead of imagining a clean starting point where the company suddenly appears, it becomes more like a gradual emergence from prior robotics experimentation. Figures like William Afton and Henry Emily are then not just restaurant owners, but engineers who had already been developing animatronic systems independently. The Mimic program, in this context, could represent one of those early branches of experimentation, something not originally intended for children's entertainment, but later adapted, directly or indirectly, into it. If that's the case, then the 70s timeline gains more weight because it allows enough room for that progression. You would have an early period of experimentation, possibly in the early to mid-1970s, where foundational technologies are developed. Then, as those technologies become stable enough for public use, they are scaled down and commercialized in Fredbear's Family Diner. Only after that success would Fazbear Entertainment formally emerge as a company in the late 70s or early 80s, taking those ideas and turning them into a brand. At the same time, there is another way to interpret the Mimic's place in the timeline that keeps the company's official founding closer to the early 80s. In this version, the Mimic is not evidence of a long prior history, but rather parallel or slightly later development that runs alongside Fazbear Entertainment's early growth. The advanced nature of the Mimic could then be explained as a separate line of innovation, something experimental that doesn't reflect the standard technology used in the restaurants. Under this interpretation, Fazbear Entertainment could still have been founded in the early 1980s, with the Mimic representing a more cutting-edge project happening just outside the main business. What makes the before secret of the Mimic period so important is that it highlights a divide between invention and commercialization. Even if Fazbear Entertainment as a named company did not exist yet, the ideas that would define it almost certainly did. Animatronics capable of performance, interaction, and eventually more complex behaviors had to be conceptualized and tested somewhere. The Mimic suggests that those early experiments may have been more ambitious, and possibly more dangerous, than the sanitized versions later presented in family restaurants. So when you factor in everything before those events, the argument for a 70s origin becomes less about the company itself and more about its roots. Fazbear Entertainment might officially launch in the early 1980s, but the work that made it possible likely stretches back several years earlier. The Mimic doesn't give a precise date, but it does expand the timeline backward, reinforcing the idea that what the public saw in Fredbear's family diner was just the visible tip of a much longer and more complex development process. In the end, whether Fazbear Entertainment began in the 70s or the early 80s depends largely on how one defines launch. If it means the first appearance of the characters and the diner setting, then a 70s origin feels plausible and even likely. The most balanced interpretation is that the roots lie in the 70s, while the recognizable corporate entity emerges in the early 80s, bridging the gap between a small experimental diner and the sprawling, ominous franchise that defines Five Nights at Freddy's.